you good people. How are you all going? I hope you're well. I am here to talk to you in week 4, HSP216, about a second lecture which is focused on police powers, equity and bias. Now, I thought I'd give you a little brief example of how police powers can be biased. Because of course we're talking about police roles, functions, duties, powers, etc. this week. And while I would love to focus on each of these things and the issues involved with it, we'd probably need another week to study it. So I'm just going to focus on the issues that can emerge with police powers, because it is one of the things that is ongoing and it leads to really substantial harm in the community, particularly for vulnerable communities that have a lot of police contact. So what I'm going to focus on is stop and search powers. This is one of the powers that police use that is most controversial. The reason why it's controversial is it's seemingly innocuous, right? It's fairly innocent to stop someone in the street and say, "Hey, what's your name? Where do you live? What have you been doing the last half an hour? Where are you going now and what are you planning to do for the rest of the day?" It can be a lot of the time racially motivated, and a lot of people of colour experience these stops far more than other people in the community. We can see staggering statistics in places like New York, where there are like 250,000 stop and searches in a matter of months, and just a couple of thousand of those will be white middle class folks, and the rest will be focused on people of colour. So the research is pretty damning about stop and search powers, but the irony of this whole situation is that although we know that it's not particularly great for building police legitimacy amongst people of colour, for example, because they do spend a lot of their time being searched, we also know on the flip side of that it's also really highly ineffective. So stopping and searching people leads to hardly any crime cleanup. So if like patrolling, 75% of police time is spent patrolling in different areas, driving around in cars, walking around in local neighbourhoods, yet it clears up hardly any crime, in addition to detecting hardly any crime. The best crime detection and cleanup processes most definitely emerge out of focused investigative processes where it's teams of officers working together to solve a crime. Yet we still hold on to this idea that stopping and searching people and patrolling people in public places is a good use of police time, even though we know wholeheartedly that that's not the case. And in fact, we know that it does far more harm than good. So that's the reason why I've decided to focus on stop and search powers in particular, even though they have a whole range of other powers. So police largely set their own priorities, which is why stop and search can often target equity groups. And this includes even people like folks that have cognitive disabilities that are walking around in public places. They might look like they are under the influence of alcohol, but they're actually not. And it's their cognitive issues which are making them seem like they're under the influence of alcohol. So those people can be targeted by police officers on the basis of looking like a particular type of person. And they can sometimes get stopped multiple times a day. Young people are one of the biggest categories that fall into these sorts of powers, particularly with stop and search. And they actually had to implement a receipting system in Victoria because the police officers in certain areas kept stopping African and Afghani young people so much. Sometimes it was more than 10 times a day. So you can imagine that the tolerance level of any person would be tested, even after the 5th time of being stopped in a single day. But to get to 10 is pretty serious. And it does raise significant questions about police profiling. So I've got a couple of examples here from my own research that I've done. because a lot of this comes up in the research around policing LGBTQ folks in particular. So one young lesbian female says, suspicious is such a great term. It's like when your parents say nice. It can mean so many things. Mum, I'm going to get a tattoo. That's nice. Suspicious could be used to cover all manner of sin. Now, the reason why Ticket is talking about this is because police often justify their use of stop and search powers on the basis that people look suspicious. And in fact, this is the exact wording that they use in the legislation in Queensland where this research was done. So a young person might look suspicious if they're wearing black clothing, if they have a weird hairstyle with colour in it, if they've got a bit of a limp, if they're holding on to some sort of bottle that looks like it's got a substance that could be alcohol, if they've got a bunch of Sharpies sticking out of the back pocket on a train. All of these things can mark a young person as suspicious. Even running down the road in a pair of jeans is something that one young person that I've interviewed has been stopped and searched for. Now, he was homeless. He didn't have any running clothes, but he was adamant about keeping up his health and well-being even though he was homeless. And he would run every day in his jeans, and the police would stop him on a regular basis even though he was doing that. It's pretty challenging stuff. So suspicion is one thing that leads to these types of stop and searches, even though we know that they don't really lead to any productive police outcomes. So others say things like, just coming up and going through your things. I don't like the way they can just come up and request ID and ask you to empty your pockets just because you look suspicious. If you go to work and you get pulled up, you're a couple of minutes late and then you're half an hour late for work. And Tayden says, they always tell me that when they check my bag. You look suspicious. They just like to search my bags because basically I look suspicious. So these words came up a lot for these young people, and it's very clear that stop and search is something that's being directed at them, even if it's not in a malicious way by these police officers. The main problems that we have with stop and search is that it's low visibility, meaning that records can be constructed after the event. So whatever happened on the spot, police can think about it for a while and come up with a reason about why they've done that and how that young person ended up with a fine. The number of stops, though, are the major concern around stop and search. So, for instance, Sanders and Young says police records show that in 2004-5, black people were 6 times more likely, and Asians 1.8 times more likely to be stopped and searched than white people in public spaces. Now, justifiability is another major concern. They use this as a tool of public reassurance, and that's what we hear from police officers. We have a visible presence. This makes people feel safer, but there was often no reasonable suspicion of a crime that was happening at that particular point. In addition to justifiability, though, is how the stops are actually carried out. And this is a concern for a number of reasons. Now, often people, because they're being stopped and searched so many times, often in the space of a day, sometimes in the space of a week, sometimes in a month, you get the idea. So they perceive that they are being harassed by police. And some people argue that they are genuinely known by police simply because they get stopped and searched so often and they feel like they're being targeted, but rightfully so if they're being stopped so many times by so many different officers. However, on the flip side of that, of course, there's a range of different types of behaviours that come from the police officers in these processes, which are pretty damn concerning. Number one, they can use offensive and racist language. They can use homophobic language or transphobic language, and they can do things which are really, really unreasonable. So, for instance, in the study that I did back in 2010, I interviewed a young person who was a trans person, and she wore a wig. And so the police officer that stopped her and searched her was taunting her and saying that, she shouldn't dress like that, and accusing her of lying because her license was showed the indicator that she was male and she was identifying as a female with a female name. And eventually the police officer got to the point where he just grabbed her wig and ripped it off her head, which of course is just blatant discrimination, if not a form of assault. If the hair had been attached to her head, it would have been particularly problematic indeed. Nonetheless, those types of interactions form a very serious form of violence and discrimination, which stops people from going to police in the first instance. So that young person said, if I had my choice, I would never go to police, even if it was a situation where someone was murdered. They said that they wouldn't go and get some assistance. So it has really significant long-term implications. There are a whole bunch of different factors which influence police discretion when it comes to stop and search, but I would argue more broadly in any element of policing work, so their duties, their roles, their powers, and their functions. All of these factors influence the way police make decisions with people in public places or in their own homes, whether they decide to prosecute or whether they decide not to prosecute. It's all influenced by age, ethnicity, race, gender, indigeneity, sexuality. All of these things are important factors. So there's personal factors like learned attitudes and beliefs, entrenched assumptions or prejudices about particular groups. It might be just the way that they think about people that are involved in terrorism, for instance. A great example of that is that people often think of Muslim people as being terrorists. However, we know that most of the serious terrorist acts that have been happening in Australian territories are done by white Anglo-Saxon people, not Muslim people. In fact, usually fundamentalist Christian people. So it's those types of prejudices which can inform what happens with discretion. It's negative views or perspectives of others, of course, and generalisation, the idea I've had a really bad interaction with an Indian cab driver or an Uber driver, and therefore all Indian people suck. So generalisation and stereotyping is another big personal concern that influences the way police discretion is rolled out. The other thing is there's a whole bunch of professional situational issues which make discretion challenging. It's targeting of particular populations. So there might be some concerns with a group of young people that are constantly breaking and entering in a particular area, and they need to target them in order to stop that from happening so that people are not victimised. However, at the same time, that might extend to a whole range of other young people that weren't perhaps under suspicion previously. Responses to crime waves, so they need to be seen to be doing something because crime is increased in this area. There's crackdowns on particular crime problems, and of course assumptions about high crime areas. So a particular area might look really weathered and run down, the broken windows type of theory situation, but there's actually not a lot of crime happening there at all. But they target that area specifically because it looks like a place where crime happens. And of course, policing of hotspots. So all of these things influence the way that policing discretion happens, the way that they make decisions about how to stop and search, who to stop and search, where it happens, what time it happens, all of those types of things. An interesting little fact for you on this particular slide. Did you know that more experienced officers who are senior and have more experience over a long period of time are far less likely to use arrest as a means to achieve an outcome? So that in itself indicates that we've got some things we need to think about. So what do the young people think about police searches? We've seen a couple of examples now, but Ticket was one of the ones that we raised in another lecture, and she talks about this again previously in another slide. But there's other stuff that is related to the invasion of personal space and privacy, which young people particularly are not very comfortable with. So sitting around in King George Square, there's a bunch of goths and punks. Cops would come up and they would ask to look in your bag just randomly because you look a bit sus. There's that word again, suspicious. If you said no, they would take that as reasonable cause. And in Queensland, there is legislation in place that says if they have reasonable cause to think that something's in there, they can actually force the young person to be searched. then they would say, well, you said no, so now we have cause to believe that you've got drugs or something. It wasn't. It was like, oh, I have a pencil case with Telfast and paracetamol in it and a Ventolin and a box of tampons. Ew. I don't want someone going through your bag and pouring out your shit. So ultimately, these are the issues that are raised for young people. And you can imagine how much more that's exacerbated when the young person is involved in stop and search, which involve pat-down powers. Again, this is something that is available to officers in Queensland in particular, and whether or not that young person has been abused physically or sexually as a young person or as a child. Which is quite often, unfortunately, an issue which is experienced by these young people who spend a lot of time in public places because they're homeless or for whatever other reason. So all of these things make stop and search powers quite difficult and challenging, not only for police officers, but most importantly, for vulnerable communities. And it's why we need to actually think more critically about whether or not these are good ways of doing policing and if they're productive. If only 7% of arrests are a product of a stop and search, why are we doing this? Should we continue to do these forms of policing? They are marginal for preventing and detecting crime. They are excellent for creating negative attitudes, and we have overwhelming evidence about that now. Those who are most often victimised, unfortunately, and those in need of police assistance are most often the ones that are subject to these stops and searches. I hate them, they're dogs. If I could help a friend of mine cover up a crime, then I probably would, because the police don't deserve help. So these types of attitudes will definitely stop people from assisting police, will stop them from going to police when they're in need of help, and most importantly, will put them in more danger of further victimisation down the track. So all of these things are things that we need to consider in terms just of police powers, and just talking about one police power, because it is very much a balancing act between due process and the way that powers are distributed amongst different people in the community. I hope that was useful to think about, and I'll chat to you all soon. Bye!